Welcome into the FutureSox RoundUp. I am Elijah Evans, and I am joined, as always, by my wonderful co-host, Jeff Cohen. We are here today with a little bit of a fun episode. We're going to start off the top by talking a few things about spring training, just going over a few things that I've noticed in the last week. And then we're going to do something a little different today. We're going to look back at the past decade of draft classes and top 5 prospects within the White Sox system. So as we kind of look forward, and we're always talking about the current prospects, it's worth noting some of the things that we've seen previously. So we're going to look and dive deep into kind of some of the key draft picks and then the top prospects by year, starting in 2014 all the way up till last season, just as a fun way to kind of recognize the system over the years, how it's changed, how it's adjusted. And then on top of that, where we are today, right? Like the farm system, as we've talked about, is in a very different place than it's been at many different points over the past decade. So kind of reflecting upon the past is going to give us even more context for the future. One thing I want to mention before we dive into everything we have today is I am going to be out in Arizona doing some spring training stuff this coming week. So you want to make sure to follow me at Elijah EV8 and then follow FutureSox at FutureSox. We're going to be getting a lot of good content out there. I'm hoping to talk to some players, get some videos on the backfields and all different types of stuff that you're not going to want to miss because, with a lot of these games not being televised and then some of them not even being on radio, I'm hoping to provide a little bit more of a lens into spring training for many of our fans and followers. So definitely follow along. It's going to be fun. I'll be out there all week. And then next week on the FutureSox RoundUp, I will be talking all about everything I saw in Arizona. So that was a lot of me talking. Jeff, how you doing? How you feeling?
I'm doing good, Elijah. I'm sorry. I'm jealous that I'm not going out to Arizona with you, but I can't wait to next week because I'm going to have 1,000 questions about different guys that you're going to get a close look at this week.
Yeah, we're going to have a lot of fun next week. Definitely an episode you're going to want to check into because Jeff's going to fire questions at me and I'm going to tell you every single thing that I noticed when I was out in Arizona. Also, make sure you're following Jeff at AAA Jeff. He is going to have tons of content from White Sox prospects throughout the season. We're only a month away from the minor league season kicking off. And before you know it, Jeff's going to be talking to guys in Charlotte and Winston and Kannapolis, and it's going to be a lot of content you're not going to want to miss. So let's start with this spring training notes. I don't have a ton. The White Sox have played a variety of the regular players. There's been some good performances, some poor performances. I mentioned this. I saw you tweeted something very funny, quoting my tweet the other day. But off the top, I want to talk Nick Nastrini. This 2 games now for Nastrini. He's thrown 2 innings in each game. He's allowed 1 hit total in 4 innings pitched in spring training. Has not allowed a run, a .25 WHIP. He looks good. He looks consistent. He looks solid. I didn't get to see any video from his last start, which was unfortunate. But from what I was seeing from the pitch tracker and just from the getting out, it looks like he's committing the zone. It looks like he's attacking the zone better than he did at times last year. And right now, there's a lot of competition in terms of the White Sox rotation. Another guy that's worth mentioning, it's hard to imagine him being in the rotation immediately, but Garrett Crochet has been phenomenal. He struck out Shohei Ohtani. He struck out Mike Trout. Those are 2 of the best players in baseball. In the game against the Dodgers, game against the Angels, he struck out both of them and has generally just looked really, really good. His fastball's up to where it used to be a few years ago at 99, 100 miles an hour. He looks more consistent. He's pounding the zone a little bit more. That's someone who, the Sox have talked about making him a starter. I don't know when that happens, but seeing Crochet look good is excellent. Michael Kopech, another guy who his first game of the spring looked really solid. His command was a lot better. I watched every single pitch of his game he threw. The four seam, he was really spotting it better. The velo was up a tiny bit. The slider was just a lot less flat than I think it was at times last year. It had a little bit more depth to it. And he was working that cutter a little bit as well. I want to see more from his changeup. But generally, those are 3 young pitchers that are going to be pivotal to this team that have looked really solid so far this spring.
Elijah, have you had a chance to see Eric Fetty yet?
I have not seen Fetty. He threw, what was it, yesterday? I believe he threw yesterday, and I'm trying to remember I don't think there was video for it, so I'm going to try and see what I can
Right.
find on Fetty. He had a solid start. He gave up a run, but I don't think he had a decent game, so I'm curious to see that. And then again today, Mike Soroka pitched today for the first time with the organization, and another game without video, so unfortunately didn't get to see either of those so far, but again, next week, hoping to see those guys pitch in person, which is going to be great.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of competition. It's good competition. I think obviously Dylan Cease, as Pedro Grafal said this today in an interview, Dylan Cease is the ace. He's going to start opening day unless he's traded somehow. But that's the one 100% thing. I think he didn't say this directly, but Fetty has a spot considering the contract he was just signed to.
Right.
Beyond that, we don't really know. So it's fun to see these guys look good in spring training. And I think Nastrini is the one X factor of a guy who I think could really just force the hand to the White Sox. If he has another 2-3 starts in spring training where he looks just as good as he has so far, I don't see how you can leave him off the roster as a 24-year-old who's already reached AAA and who has the upside of a really solid starter.
Yep. Got to agree.
Those are some of my notes. Nothing crazy. Again, we will have way more spring training content once I'm out there this week. Make sure you're following along. I'm going to be pumping out videos and just my opinions and everything else I'm seeing in Arizona. So let's dive into this kind of looking back at the White Sox history. We'll start with 2014. So this is 10 years ago. We're going all the way a decade back. Jeff, I'm going to let you kind of guide us here in this draft class talk. 2014, who were some of the notable draft picks, and what does that look like today when we look back at the White Sox?
All right, let's take a look here. Well, 2014.
I'm seeing Carlos Rodon, I know.
Carlos Rodon was the big name. Couple of relievers of note, but Rodon was the big one. And he was a first-round draft pick, so that's a good sign for the White Sox.
Yeah. I mean, Rodon it's a hard one to evaluate, I think, because, that's a guy who we know the talent's there. The talent's been there, right? That's not a doubt with Rodon. We knew that. It was a frustrating start to his career, I think. He had dealt with all the different injuries he dealt with. He really never got on track. We finally saw everything he was capable of in 2021, which was awesome. I remember I was at his no-hitter at the beginning of the season in 2021, and it was one of the best games I've ever been to personally. So it's a shame that Rodon has had so many injury issues, but the guy's talent is there, and you really can't blame the draft pick. You can't fault injury. We know that he had a first-round talent, and he has shown that at times with, even with 2021 with the Sox, 2022 with the Giants. Last year was a rough one for him dealing with injuries again with the Yankees, but a successful career when you consider everything. And when you put injuries aside, it looks like a good draft pick in hindsight.
Yep. Now, the question is, you and I have discussed this, that our goal today is to get a sense as to how well the White Sox have done. And we can look at it in a vacuum, but another way to do it, and what I've chosen to do, is just arbitrarily pick 4 other organizations. And then we can do a comparison. How did the White Sox do versus other teams? And so the 4 teams I selected were the Rays, Braves, Dodgers, and Astros. And I think they're all have a reputation as being fairly strong organizations that have had success in the draft.
100%.
So looking at 2014, there's really no one of note for the Rays and the Braves. For the Dodgers, they had 1 starter, Alex Verdugo, and the Astros, J.D. Davis. So really, I think the White Sox ended up pretty strong there.
Yeah, I mean, a Rodon there is definitely a good pick, and I think beyond, the later rounds might not have been as great, but when you compare, the point of comparing this for everybody who's listening, right, is that these are organizations that have had continual success. Those 4 teams have been some of the best teams for the last decade pretty consistently, and have always been teams that have not only spent money, but teams that have built through organizational development. So when you compare those teams, it's important to kind of take things with a grain of salt, because, yeah, you look at the White Sox draft and it's, Carlos Rodon's the only big league regular that they got out of that, sure. But it doesn't seem like there was a ton of excellent players taken in that draft by a lot of these other premier, organizational teams. So that's good. Let's get into the top prospect list, because this is kind of a different angle of, where things were at in 2014. The top 5 prospects for the White Sox. This is a funny list. This one's one of the better ones, I think, of all these top 5s by year, and this is all MLB Pipeline rankings. The first overall prospect for the White Sox going in 2014 was Eric Johnson. Eric Johnson was a right-handed pitcher who, I remember when he was coming up, he definitely had a lot of excitement going with it around him. He went to Cal. He was a big time college arm. He was the number 1 prospect. He debuted in 2013 briefly, made 5 starts and looked pretty solid. Came up in 2014 and just really struggled the entire season. 2014, he went back down to Charlotte. Came up in 2015 made a few games here and there, was pretty solid all around, had a really good year in Charlotte, and it was like, maybe he's bouncing back. 2016 ends up getting moved. He struggled in his few games with the Sox, goes to the Padres, made 4 starts for the Padres, and that was his last major league appearance. He bounced around the minors for another year or 2 and was out of baseball by the end of 2018. So that was, first prospect on the list, and that's how it goes sometimes, right?
Right? Yeah. Yeah. There's an element of luck to especially when you draft those pitchers, right? Are they going to stay healthy?
100%. And then the rest of 2014, we can dive into each player one by one. But the second prospect was Matt Davidson. The third was Tim Anderson. The fourth was Marcus Simeon. And then the fifth was Micah Johnson. So in that list, right, Tim Anderson, multiple-time All-Star. I know a lot of White Sox fans have negative feelings about him since the last year or two. I am not one of those people. I will never be one of those people. I will always look back at Tim Anderson with positive feelings. The guy was just he was amazing for multiple seasons, and he was really the heart and soul of the White Sox for many of the past few years. And then Marcus Simeon's a guy who, it's a shame, right? It's a bummer the White Sox moved him. He struggled in his rookie season, and in 2014, his first mostly season, he played 64 games with the White Sox, only had a 672 OPS, was moved to Oakland, had a few solid years, really blossomed in 2019, kind of a late bloomer, right? But he was ranked highly for a reason as a prospect. He always had a really strong hit tool, and he was a solid defender at both shortstop, and then moved over to second where he became kind of a premium defender. It took him some time, but in 2019 with the A's, he broke out, went to Toronto in 2021, was awesome, ended up signing this massive deal with Texas. Last season was one of, the better position players in Major League Baseball, and especially infielders. So that's another guy where it's a bummer. And then you look at a Matt Davidson and a Micah Johnson, who neither amounted to anything. Micah Johnson played
Right.
a total of 61 games in his career, was out of baseball by 2018. Matt Davidson had a few moments with the White Sox. There was a moment here or there. I remember a few Matt Davidson home runs where it was like, oh, this guy could do something. Had a brief stint in the majors again, played 13 games between Arizona and Oakland in 2022, and is now, I think, out of baseball. He might be trying to make a comeback at some point, but has not been on a roster since the end of 2022.
Well, and I would just point out to our viewers and listeners that you did some research on the White Sox, and I did research on these other organizations. We really don't know. We have an idea, but we really don't know until the end of the show how the White Sox really fared. Now, all these teams have had, their Matt Davidsons, guys that just didn't quite reach their potential and have the kind of careers we thought. But I think the question is not who didn't make it, but how many guys came through and had great careers, right? And so far, we've got Tim Anderson and Marcus Simeon and Carlos Rodon. That's a great start for 2 years.
But you got to factor in that Marcus Simeon wasn't with the White Sox when he did that. So that's an organizational drawback,
right,
because he got traded before he ever blossomed fully. So
right.
In reality, only two players that have actually been successful with the White Sox, at least.
Okay. All right. I was just saying, in terms of your ability to draft Major League talent.
For sure. 100%. Going into 2015, tell us about some of the, the top draft guys in 2015, and then where we're at now from there.
Well, the number one pick was Carson Fulmer, and the team didn't have a number 2 or number 3 pick, but there were 2 late round picks of interest, Sebi Zavala in the 12th round, and in the 22nd round, and still kicking, Danny Mendick.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah,
tell us.
22nd.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on those 3 from that draft class?
Well, when you don't have a second or third round draft pick, you're really handicapped, right?
Yeah, definitely.
It's unfortunate. You can't really expect the 4th and 5th rounders to pop.
Right. And Fulmer was a guy that I remember when we drafted him, I was like, that guy could be an ace. And I think a lot of people thought that. He had all the upside in the world. The stuff was disgusting. He was really advanced for his age. He dominated in college. That was a guy who just, I think most people would have said Carson Fulmer was going to be, still pitching at a high level in the major leagues today, really. I know that was what, 9 years ago, but I think that most people expected him to have a really long major league career, and things have just not gone his way, unfortunately. And he's become, he's at, I'm not sure where he is right now. Let me check. But he, I think he made 3. Yeah, there you go. He made 3 major league appearances last season for the Angels. I knew he had kind of kicked it a little bit, but he's mostly been in the minors, bouncing around a little bit. I think he technically is with the Angels organization still right now, but only, total of 77 career games in the major leagues with a 6.14 ERA is just not at all what was expected from a guy who was a first rounder.
Right.
Looking at, and then Mendick and Zavala, right? Solid big leaguers. I mean, they've had, for late round picks, they've both been big league pieces for the White Sox for a handful of time. Yeah. Looking at the 2015 prospect rankings, 1 and 2 were Carlos Rodon and Tim Anderson, who we've already touched on. Ultimately, both guys that were drafted highly and had major league careers. I don't want to hear complaints about those two. There's nothing to complain about. Number 3, Frankie Montas, another guy like Marcus Semien, who was drafted by the White Sox and was expected to be kind of a big deal, ended up getting traded, moved to Oakland, kind of had a breakout year in 2019. Yeah, he had a 2.63 ERA in 2019, really started to find his footing, had another really good season in 2021, and then was moved to the Yankees, was with the Yankees. Now he just signed with the Reds in free agency. Has had ups and downs, but generally speaking, another guy that the White Sox kind of gave up on too early.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're going to see a lot of those as we go forward, right?
That's
one
thing.
That's just baseball. I don't think that's really a criticism of the White Sox.
100%.
Yeah.
It's just tricky. There's guys you can evaluate and you can think you've got talent and it just doesn't work out with you, and then they change the scenery and it clicks, right? That's how it goes. The fourth ranked prospect on the team was Spencer Adams, who was drafted, I want to say, a few years prior to that. I think maybe it was just 1 year before. I think he might have been a 2014 draft guy. He was super high projection. He fell back in the draft a little bit. He kind of had a lot of excitement around him. Never made a major league appearance. He was in the White Sox organization for a long time. Had his spurts here and there where he looked solid. 2018 was a pretty good year for him. In Charlotte in 2019, really struggled, and then ended up being released from the organization and has not bounced. I don't believe he's pitched since then with a major league affiliation. So another guy, unfortunate, right? A lot of draft projection, second round pick, a lot of hype around him, and it just sometimes just doesn't happen. And then Micah Johnson was the 5th ranked prospect that year, who we talked about earlier, as someone who has a few appearances here and there, but has been out of baseball since 2018. So when you look at that draft, on that prospect list, though, 3 guys at the top that have all had big league careers, just 2, the last one being someone who didn't do it with the organization, just like Semien on the last list.
Right. And then just quickly to look at those 4 other organizations and just see how they did, just as a rough comparison. So the Rays drafted Brandon Lau and Jake Cronenworth that year. The Braves drafted Mike Soroka and Austin Riley. The Dodgers drafted Walker Buehler, and the Astros. You remember back then the Astros were awful, but they were really putting a lot of emphasis on their ability to draft. Well, that year they drafted Alex Bregman and Kyle Tucker.
So when you look around the league, that's a rough one, that draft class. When the White Sox came away with Carson Fulmer, who didn't pan out, in addition to 2, career backups, and then you look at those guys, Austin Riley, Kyle Tucker, those are some of the best players in Major League Baseball. So that's a year where you definitely can say that was not the best year for the draft for the White Sox. Moving into 2016, who are some of the picks in 2016 that you down, Jeff?
Well, we had Zach Collins at number 1, Zach Birdie at number 1, Alec Hansen at number 2, and Alex Call at number 3. Another bust of a class, right?
Yeah, you look at number 5, 5th rounder in that year actually was Jimmy Lambert, who has carved out a decent career in the bullpen and is going to be in the bullpen this year probably. And then you can also look at the 10th round with Zach Remillard, who has been a backup here and there the last 2 seasons. 20th round Matt Foster, who had a brief stint in the bullpen, hasn't gone much where with it. But yeah, that's a rough first 3 rounds. I think the Collins was that was in a time where he was supposed to be the post AJ Przinsky catcher. I think a lot of people had him as the next great catcher in Chicago. The bat was tons of power. He was always a little bit weaker defensively, but it was like, oh, this guy's going to be like a premium offensive catcher wherever, or first baseman if he ends up having to move there. Either way, he was expected to really just hit. And Alec Hansen's another guy who was really, really high projections for a long time, honestly. So that's a hard one to look at. I think that draft class is. Who'd you say the last 2 on that list were?
Zach Birdie. Yeah, I mean, there was a time where he looked like he was going to be a stud, and then Alex Call.
Yeah, so I mean, those are kind of all guys that didn't go much of anywhere. I think Birdie pitched this year. Actually, I remember watching him with Tampa. He got to the major leagues this year with Tampa. He's had a pretty good minor league career. He's been really good the last 2 seasons in the minors.
Right.
So maybe he's still, Birdie's still 28 years old. He was drafted pretty young. So that's a guy who is still around. He's still kicking it. Zach Collins is, I believe, I know he was with Cleveland for a while. I think he played a few games with Cleveland. I don't think he's gotten much action, and I believe he's playing internationally now, if I'm
Oh,
remembering right.
wow.
And then, yeah, and then Alec Hansen is, he last pitched for Birmingham in 2021, and has not been with an organization since then. So unfortunate, right? Alex, let's see, Alex Call. Alex Call, actually, I remember him playing this year. Yeah, Alex Call that's funny. Alex Call was a starter this season for Washington. He played
Yeah,
128 games this year for the
yeah.
Nationals. Interesting.
Had
So
an okay year, I seem to recall.
yeah, not great, but not bad actually. He played
Yeah,
last 2022, he was solid. 2023, he wasn't quite as good, but that's interesting. Another guy there, that's another player on this list who, once he left the organization, has actually carved out a career for himself.
right, right.
So there you go. That was a rough one. Again, looking at the top prospects that season, it was a lot of the guys we've already mentioned. Carson Fulmer was the first prospect. We talked about that. Just really unfortunate. Just never quite found his command. Tim Anderson was the second prospect. Still, he ended up debuting that season and had a great rookie year. Well, some shine showed promise. Spencer Adams was the 3. We talked about him already. And then the 4 and 5 in 2016 were Adam Engel and Trey Michalowski. Adam Engel, major
Yeah,
leaguer. He was a fourth
yeah.
outfield type, good defense, good speed. Never quite found it with the bat. I think he's in AAA right now for somebody. He played a few games last year for the Padres, played for the Sox all the way from 2018 or 2017 all the way to 2022. So was a regular on the major league team. Never really found it with the bat, but good defense. And then Trey Michalowski last played for Charlotte in 2019 and has not been with an org since then. So that prospect list is rough. You see Tim Anderson there at number 2, but there's really nobody else on that list who is of note in their career.
All right. And again, just looking at our other
Yeah.
4 organizations,
Yeah.
Rays, Josh Lowe and Jake Fraley. The Braves, Ian Anderson, who was pretty impressive till he got hurt. And then the Dodgers, Gavin Lux and Will Smith, 2 key cogs. And then for the Astros, the poster child of a pitcher who was so highly vaulted and just couldn't overcome injuries. In fact, he's still trying. Forrest Whitley.
Yeah, that was
Yeah,
the same time prospect. So, right, even the best teams have players that just don't work out, even if they're drafted really highly and they can have all the talent in the world. It's just not always going to work. But again, that's another draft class where those are multiple big league pieces drafted by some of those teams. Meanwhile, the White Sox don't have anybody who really became a significant big league piece from that class.
And you know what, Elijah? I mentioned the Dodgers, Gavin Lux and Will Smith. I didn't look at page 2. In that same draft class, Dustin May and Tony Gonsolin. Wow.
Yeah, that's the Dodgers
Wow.
for you.
Yeah.
That is the definition of the Dodgers drafting for you. That's 4 guys who are all significant big league pieces at a
Yep.
time that, and with the White Sox class who didn't have anybody from that draft class. So, all right, what's up next? 2017. Let's hear about 2017 draft class, Jeff.
Well, we've got 3 interesting names in the first 3 rounds. Jake Berger, number 1, Gavin Sheets, number 2, and Luis Gonzalez, number 3.
All right.
And the jury's still out, I would say. I mean, it doesn't look great, but it could end up solid.
Yeah, I think again, unfortunately, Jake Berger, no longer with the White Sox, right? But we really saw everything he was capable of the last year and a half, and that's a guy who battled through a ton of injuries, had the double Achilles tear, had a really hard start to his career once he was drafted by the White Sox, and he the dude can hit, man. The defense is still shaky. He still strikes out a lot, but the dude can simply hit. Last year was an amazing season for him. 28 home runs, finished the year, or 34 home runs. Pardon me, I was looking at doubles. 28 doubles, 34 home runs last season for Jake Berger. Finished the year with the Marlins. Is expected to be a key cog for them. Gavin Sheets is a tricky one. He has shown flashes over the past 3 seasons with the White Sox, but ultimately, he has been forced to play right field where he struggles, generally speaking, has found his footing to a decent degree. And then it's the power that excites you, but it hasn't really gone anywhere. It's been 10-ish home runs a year the past 3 seasons. Last year was definitely a rough year for him. He's kind of battling for a spot now on the roster heading into this season. So another guy that's interesting. And then Luis Gonzalez, yet another player who didn't get anywhere with the White Sox. Really, he played in a total of 9 games with the White Sox between 2020 and 2021. went over to the Giants, was pretty solid for the Giants in
Yeah.
2022. He had a big league role, and then last year was mostly in AAA for the Yankees, but is someone who's at the very least a AAA quality player at this point in his career and still around. Not a bad draft class. It's not great.
Let me put you on the spot, Elijah. Even if it's with another team, what do you think the future looks like for Gavin Sheets? Is he a major league regular for somebody else?
I am not sure I see it. I think that his approach and his offense just has not gotten there. And because he struggles in right field, he's really best fit to play first base. And if the bat is not where you'd think it is be at first base, that bat, what he's done offensively just can't survive really. I don't think it's impossible. I think that it probably is not with the White Sox. I think he could be realistically, I think whether it's the Sox or not, a bench left-handed power bat is probably his role in the future. I don't see him being a significant starter, and I honestly wouldn't be surprised if he spends some time in AAA this year.
All right.
What about you? Where are you at?
No, I think that's fair. It's this year is going to be fascinating to see how many, if any, at bats he gets in Chicago. Right?
Yeah, it is going to be interesting. He doesn't have a spot. The last 2 years he had a spot going into camp. This year he's fighting for his spot. He doesn't have one locked up. So
Right.
it's going to be interesting to see if some of these non-roster invites push for his spot for sure, because it's not guaranteed. 2017, this is where, so you just said the draft class, which was still another kind of draft class. This is where the prospect list completely takes a turn because of the Chris Sale trade, the Jose Quintana trade, and the
Oh,
so this is where we start to see a whole new influx of players. For the top 4 players are players that weren't drafted by the team, were brought in via trades. That's Yohan Moncada, Lucas Giolito, Michael Kopech, and Reynaldo Lopez, with Carson Fulmer rounding it out at 5, who I think made his debut later that season or maybe the year after. So 2017 list is the top 4 guys are all non-drafted by the team. So we're not talking about the team draft, but we're talking about players that were acquired at the start of the rebuild that was supposed to, bring glory back to Chicago, right? So starting with Moncada, this is probably a topic for a whole nother podcast, to be honest, with some of these players here. But Yohan Moncada, it's talent. He was the number 2 overall prospect in baseball that season. Brought over from the Red Sox and as the headliner of the Chris Sale deal. He came up with the Sox in 2017 that season. Pretty rough start, but not bad. Showed some signs. 2018, same thing, was a first season as a full-time big leaguer. Some moments, a lot of walks in that season where you got to see kind of his approach develop a lot. And then 2019 Moncada feels like a fever dream looking back at it. A 915 OPS, 25 home runs, and just truly one of the better hitters in baseball that season. That was while playing, worth noting, Gold Glove defense. He moved over to third base after coming up as a second baseman and became an elite defender at third base. So that 2019 season was special. It really was. It was all that it was the first step, at least we thought, of everything that he could be. 2020, COVID, injury, I'll negate that. 2021 definitely took a step back, still a productive big leaguer. 2022 bottomed out, was one of the worst offensive players in the league. Last season, a little better, had a good stretch at the end of the season, but the injuries have just continued to pile up. He's only played around 100 games the past 2 seasons each. So it's hard to judge with Moncada. He was the top prospect in the team. He was the top prospect in baseball. Really one of the better prospects the White Sox have ever had. But it just has not been the career that many wanted from him.
Yeah, a fascinating trade. I mean, you get Michael Kopech and the number 1 prospect in baseball. I mean, you can't do better than that. It's just a question of whether these guys pan out. But
yeah,
I'm sorry, I was going to actually change the subject for just a second. I've got another question for you. So we're talking about building the White Sox through the draft, but of course there are other ways to do it. One is signing international players, and we can talk about that and what success or lack of success the White Sox have had. Another is through trades. And here was an example of some terrific trades that the White Sox made that year. And then if you add in the trades they made at the deadline last year, I would argue that the White Sox in the last 5 or 6 years have done really well trading from minor leaguers.
I generally agree with you. I've always been a fan of a lot of the trades they've made. It just, in the moment, the trades have looked really good. Looking back at them now, you can't really see the results that have come from some of the trades. I think the
Right.
trade with the sale trade, right? These top 4 prospects we're discussing now, Kopech, another guy who came up, showed a ton of promise. He had to deal with a lot of arm injuries. He missed the entire 2019 season, sat out 2020, looked good in 2021, was great out of the bullpen, or great out of the bullpen in 2021, looked solid as a starter in 22. And then last year was a really hard year for him. He's looking to bounce back this year, right? The other trade, the Adam Eaton trade, actually looked a lot better. In all honesty, Lucas
Yeah.
Giolito was the best pitcher on the White Sox for multiple seasons,
Yeah.
and now is, he had a rough year the last year or two, and is now with Boston. 2022 was rough for him. Last season he was good with the White Sox actually before getting traded and flipped for another guy who we're going to talk about later, top prospect. But that trade, and then Lopez, right, struggled at points, kind of had to go into a more of a relief role after struggling as a starter. But also multiple really quality big league seasons for the White
Yeah.
Sox, was probably the best reliever in 2022. So that trade, in hindsight, looks pretty good. And those were the second and fourth ranked prospects in the system. And then also that trade, he's not ranked as highly. He was ranked 10th in 2017. Dane Dunning, too, who ended up as
Right.
another guy who's carved out a really solid big league career and brought over Lance Lynn, who I know he was rough last year, but was really solid for the Sox in 2022. So that
Absolutely.
trade looked really good. And this is what we're talking about with the farm system. It's not all the draft. There's a lot more that goes into that. Tell me any good comparisons for the 2017 with some of those other teams.
All right, let's take a quick look. It looks like a kind of a lean year. The Rays drafted Drew Rasmussen and Taylor Walls and Josh Fleming. The Braves had one draft pick of note, Kyle Wright. The Dodgers, after that phenomenal 2016, the only draft pick of note was Connor Wong. And if the Astros, the same thing, nothing special. Corey Jolt, Jake Myers, and Chaz McCormick.
Three big leaguers right now, but yeah.
Yeah.
So not a great year for the Sox, but again, that was the year where the trade capital was really solid. Going to 2018, let's talk some draft class, and then there's another big trade we have to talk from that year too.
Oh, man. Wow. This will be interesting.
Oh, no.
So 2018 is Nick Madrigal at 1, Steele Walker at 2, Connor Pilkington at 3, and then one of those late round guys who has popped is Davis Martin at 14.
Okay. Well, I mean, Madrigal is a tricky one. I think that's a guy who we were hoping was going to be, the second baseman of the future. I think that was kind of always generally the hope with him. It didn't quite happen. It was hard to. It's tricky. He was flipped in that Kimbrel deal, which is infamous now, and he's carved out a role for himself with the Cubs on the other side of town. But definitely never became that elite contact superstar that he was supposed to be. He was looked at coming out of college as like the best bat to ball skills in the draft class, and a guy that was just going to get on base no matter what. And it really has not gone that way for him. Steele Walker, Connor Pilkington, nothing of note there. Davis Martin, I'm hoping to see Davis Martin reach the big league team this year, to be honest. He looks healthy. He's going into camp trying to get healthy and make an impact this year. So that's somebody to watch, but not a lot there in that draft class as well.
Yeah. One thought about Nick Madrigal. Yeah, whether or not he would have been the answer at second base, even just being league average, ever since the trade, that position has been a black hole with the White Sox.
That's 100% true. Looking at the 2018 top prospects, another big trade of note from that rebuild that kind of happened at the end of late in 2017 was the Jose Quintana trade. And then also an international signing who is, of all these signings, players, everything is, the shining star amongst everything else. So the top prospect was Eloy Jimenez in 2018, who was acquired as the headliner of the Dylan Cease deal. I remember when he was a prospect coming up with the Cubs, there's a video of him hitting a light tower, a 500-foot home run, and it was like, this dude's insane. And Jimenez is similar to Moncada, right? We don't need to talk too much about it. Injuries. The bat talent is there. He has become a full-time DH, which is fine. But it's just all about getting the guy healthy and keeping him on the field and seeing what he can do. So we'll see what happens. This is going to be kind of a make or break year for Jimenez. Kopech was number 2 that year. We talked about him. Number 3, Luis Robert Jr., who I remember the day when he signed with the White Sox. I saw my phone notification and I looked over at my friend and I was like, this guy is going to be awesome. And he was a crazy contract that he signed to when he came over, and is obviously the best player in the organization right now. Alec Hansen was 4. We talked about that. didn't happen. And then number 5 was kind of the add-on in the Eloy Jimenez deal, which was Dylan Cease.
Yeah.
So that one worked out pretty well. The 2018 prospect list, Eloy and Luis and Cease all being on the top of that list is pretty good, all things considered. I know Alec Hansen didn't go well, but Dylan Cease being the 5th-ranked prospect that year and being the ace of the team now for the last few seasons is a pretty good turnout from that year.
Yeah, we're talking about 2 really mediocre drafts back to back, but 2 years of phenomenal trades, just phenomenal.
And it sucks because I think you look back now and it's like, yeah, we had all those players acquired, and what has it amounted to? And nothing is the reality. A 2021 divisional championship is all that it's amounted to, which is unfortunate. But that doesn't mean there wasn't good things happening. And I think that's a lot of people have this skewed image of like this rebuild was a total fail, and it did fail. That the reality is that rebuild didn't work. But there was a lot of good things that happened and a lot of players that were brought in that were the right players, and sometimes it just doesn't pan out.
Well, and I'm wondering too, let me put you on the spot again here. So some of it with these guys not panning out, right, it's just injuries and bad luck. I wonder how much, if any, was player development or lack of player development or just the way they were managed.
I think there's something to be considered there. I don't think that's a crazy thing to consider. I think it's important to take things with a grain of salt and understand that there is a lot that goes into players developing that's not just purely based on their talent. So I think that's a good point you make, and it's definitely worth thinking about. That was another rough draft class for the White Sox. 2018. Anybody of note with some of the other teams?
Well, for the Rays, 2 really big pitchers, Matthew Liberatore and Shane McClanahan. No one of note for the Braves. For the Dodgers, yet another key piece, James Outman. And 2 important pieces for the Astros, Jeremy Pena and JP France.
Yeah, so some stuff there, more than the White Sox ended with in comparison to most of those
teams, right? Again.
Shifting to 2019. 2019, what are we looking like? I know the first one, but tell us about that class.
Yeah, 2019, it was Andrew Vaughn 1, and then 2 or 3 were 2 pitchers that I think people were really optimistic about, Matthew Thompson and Andrew Dahlquist. And for whatever reason, not every pitcher hits, and they just haven't quite lived up to what people thought they were going to be.
Yeah, unfortunate. I know Thompson was just traded last week to the Cubs. So that's a guy who had a ton of stuff. The curveball was excellent coming out of high school. The arm was live. He's still a pretty young guy. I still don't think his career is over. I think he's probably due for a bullpen change or a shift to the bullpen. Dahlquist has struggled with the White Sox. And Vaughn, I like Andrew Vaughn, but 3rd overall pick, first baseman, one of the best hitters in college in Pac-12 history. He was historically good with Berkeley. It hasn't been as good as it should be, in my opinion. And I think that this is the year where we're really hoping to see an Andrew Vaughn leap, or it's going to be, what does his future look like beyond this with the White Sox?
Yeah.
Shifting over to the top prospect lists, pretty much the same guys we've all talked about. Eloy slots in at 1, Kopech 2, Cease 3, Luis Robert 4, Nick Madrigal 5. So all in all, a lot of talent, mostly traded talent, and Madrigal slotting in as the 5th. But a lot of guys that were acquired and continued to be solid. So how about the other teams in 2019?
Okay, nothing of note yet now, recognizing that some of these guys can still pan out, like Greg Jones, the number 1 pick for the Rays, but no one of note yet. For the Braves, Michael Harris, Shea Langoliers, which is significant because he was involved in the trade. I guess it was either Sean Murphy or Matt Olson, one of those.
I think that was the Olson trade. I could be wrong.
And then the Dodgers, being the Dodgers, Michael Busch and Ryan Pepio, 2 more important players. And then the Astros, Hunter Brown in the 5th round. And their number 1 pick, interestingly, Corey Lee.
Interesting. He was with the White Sox, right? So that's not a crazy draft class from any of those teams, but when you look at the White Sox, right, it's Andrew Vaughn and then pretty much nothing else from that year of note. I know DJ Gladney was that year too, who's late in the draft. Still a guy that I have some hope for. He's shown a lot of power in the minors for the White Sox, who's still around and could make a jump this year, hopefully. Shifting to 2020, this was the shortened draft, so I'm sure there's a little bit of slim pickings in terms of which year. This was the weird COVID year draft where it was only 5 rounds.
Right. And the 5 players that the White Sox took, number 1, Garrett Crochet. That looks like it could still pan out. As you noted, he's off to a great start this spring. Yeah. And then 2, 3, 4, 5. Jared Kelly, Addison Coffey, Cade Michaels, and Bailey Horn.
Yeah, it was a hard year. That's a tricky
Yeah.
year to judge because of COVID and everything else. But I think Kelly is a guy who was a ton of expectations, is still younger than I think most people realize. I think Kelly he's moved to the bullpen in the last year or two. He looked good at times out of the bullpen last year. I think his arm is live enough where you could still see him being a decent reliever in the future. Bailey Horn was just reacquired after being traded for Ryan Tepera. Was reacquired for Matthew Thompson, who we just mentioned the year prior. So that was a weird little swap. Neither of them have really become big leaguers yet, but Horn's a guy that I think the Sox are looking at as a reliever potentially in the next year or two. Not a bad draft class. The top prospect list that year was Luis Robert at number 1. Love it. Cool. Great. Andrew Vaughn, who was drafted the year before, at number 2. Michael Kopech at 3. Nick Madrigal at 4. And then Jonathan Stever at 5. Another guy who hasn't quite found it. We'll see if a fully healthy season, Stever could be something this coming season. I'm definitely curious to see what he can do this year, but it'll take him some time. He made a few major league appearances with the Sox, and I think he's around. I think he'll be in Charlotte this year probably, and just see what's in the tank for him. Not a bad group there. Robert is obviously the star. Kopech and we'll see what happens this year with him. I haven't given up. That draft class is another one that doesn't look great. I think Crochet is kind of the thing that's holding that together, right? If Crochet takes a huge step forward this year and looks healthy and like himself again, I still have a lot of hope for him. But generally speaking, another not great draft class.
So let's stop for a second and look at the last 3 years we covered. Nick Madrigal, Andrew Vaughn, Garrett Crochet. And that's it. Those are the 3 guys.
Yeah, that's
over
tough.
3 years. Yeah.
Right. And Madrigal not with the team. Crochet has been injured and has not shown yet what he's capable of. I still think he can, let's be clear. And Vaughn's a guy who's been a major leaguer for the last few years, but has still not been number 3 overall pick level.
Right.
Okay.
And unfortunately, as opposed to the previous 2 years, no noteworthy trades to at least, cover up your sins in the draft.
Right.
Yeah.
So looking at that COVID short draft, is there anybody that super stands out from those other teams?
Well, for the Braves and the Dodgers, we got some standouts. For the Braves, they've got Spencer Strider, Bryce Elder, and Jared Schuster. One pitcher who's made it and 2 others who look close. And then the Dodgers, yet again, Bobby Miller, Landon Knack, Clayton Beeter, and Gavin Stone. They only had 5 picks that year, and 4 of them are looking really good.
Yeah, 4 legit pitching prospects there, and 1 who's already a key piece of their rotation now. So yeah, I mean, it should go. There's been years, and when you look at these past 10 years, a lot of these years we're mentioning, the White Sox have walked away with maybe 1 big leaguer, and some of these other teams have walked away with multiple pieces of their core. All right, 20. We got these last few years. We're gonna zoom through some of these because I think these are a lot of guys that we've talked about in the past, and then everybody who listens to us knows about most of these players. 2021, who are the players of note in that season.
Right, and again, it's important to point out as we go through the list, it will be obvious, but a lot of these guys it's still early in their development, and so we really don't know. It's all speculation at this point. But 2021 is Colson Montgomery, Wes Kath, Sean Burke, 1, 2, 3. Others of note: Tanner McDougal, Frazier Ellard, Terrell Tatum, and Adam Hackenberg.
There's some guys there. Obviously Colson Montgomery, the number 1 prospect for the White Sox, top 15 prospect in baseball, gonna be the shortstop at some point this season, as we've talked about many times. But beyond that, there's some pieces there. I think Kath has been tough to watch so far in his career. He's struggled a lot with his approach, hasn't quite found his footing, still very young, still has upside. We're gonna see what happens from him this year. Burke's a guy we just talked about recently on the podcast, hoping we can see a fully healthy season out of him because he showed a ton of promise the last time he was fully healthy. And then some of those other guys, McDougal's a guy that is a big breakout candidate, in my opinion, for this coming season. Fully healthy now, his 2nd full season back from Tommy John. I expect him to really take a step forward this year. And then, Terrell Tatum had a big year last year. Frazier Ellard's going to be a potential bullpen option soon. There's some pieces in that draft, I would say.
Yeah, and I think it's significant. I think 2021, we're going to start to see a change with the White Sox. That in those other years, there's some misses in the first couple of rounds and no depth in the system. But I think that's starting to change in 20. We'll see that it has started to change in 21 and then really take off 22, 23.
Yeah. And again, it's those players are early in their career, so it's hard to gauge exactly where they'll end up because there is a handful of the guys from those previous years that might have looked good in their first year or two and then just didn't pan out long term. So our hindsight kind of skews that view a little bit. But generally speaking, the depth improved. 2021 top five was Vaughn, Kopech, Madrigal, who we mentioned already. And then Crochet and Jared Kelly, who we've talked about as well. Crochet is, we're hoping a big year. Kelly has not quite panned out so far, but is made a shift to the bullpen and is looking to kind of make it there. From that year, that was a pretty deep group of guys that we drafted that year, or the Sox drafted that season. Who were some of the other guys drafted by other teams in that season that may not have made it so far?
Just a couple of quick notes for the Braves: AJ Smith, Shawver, and for the Dodgers, good Lord. The previous year, Bobby Miller, Landon Knack, Clayton Beater, and Gavin Stone. Then 2021, they had Nick Nastrini and Emmett Sheehan. So they draft the pitchers and they develop them. Holy cow.
The pitching development of the Dodgers is pretty spectacular. I think anybody who follows baseball closely knows that. And hopefully the Sox are going to benefit from that because Nastrini is legit. Yep. So continuing on to 2022, I think most people know the 2022, but tell us some of these picks so far.
All right, I'm going to run through a lot because it at least now it appears to be a fairly deep draft. You got 1, 2, 3: Noah Schultz, Peyton Pallette, Jonathan Cannon, Jordan Sprinkle at 4, Tyler Schweitzer at 5, Mario Camilletti 8, Michael Turner 9, Tim Elko 10, Jacob Burke 11, Brooks Baldwin 11, Mason Adams 13, Sean Murphy 14, Billy Seidel 15. All guys who look really good right now.
Yeah, and Tristan Stivers too at 16. I did an interview with him, a guy who I think could be a really serious bullpen arm in the future too. So, I mean, and then Eric Adler, also another guy who could be a bullpen arm, was in that draft class too. So it's hard to gauge, right, when we're looking only 2 years out of this, as opposed to these other draft classes that we've seen what's happened over the last 7, 8 years plus, whatever. But this draft class so far has shown a lot of promise and a lot of depth. I'm not saying that there's 10 big leaguers in this draft because there's not. But there's a handful of players that are going to be legit big leaguers. And there's also a good amount of players that are going to be quality organizational guys who they might not be a big league impact player, but a lot of these players are going to reach the upper levels of the minors and at least contribute at that level, as opposed to some of these other drafts where half the players in the draft class haven't even made it to AA, right? So this is a pretty deep draft all around, and that reflects that on the prospect list. I think the prospect lists they don't look great. Because there were some international signings that are different than some of those draft class signings. But 2022, Colson Montgomery is the one that's a given. He was the top pick from the year before, still the top. He's been the top prospect for the last 3 years now. Oscar Colas at number 2, Jose Rodriguez at number 3, Yoelqui Cespedes at number 4,
wow,
and Norge Vera at number 5. So that was a heavy international list.
Wow.
So all 4 of those guys beyond Montgomery were international guys. So interesting to look at, only 2 years ago, but unfortunately doesn't look great for the rest of that list beyond Montgomery. I think Colas, this is going to be, we'll see what happens this year. He's probably going to start in AAA. We'll get another shot at the big leagues, I'm sure, at some point. Last year was rough, but I'm not counting him out yet. Jose Rodriguez, a guy that should get some time in the majors this year, hopefully, has looked good. The outlook on him and the profile is a little bit iffy in some ways, in my opinion, but somebody that should be a major league option this year. Cespedes has struggled a lot. Really, he got up to Charlotte at the end of the year last year, but has just not looked like a big league hitter for the most part in the last year or two. And then Norge Vera dealt with some injuries, going to be getting some innings under his belt this year, and we're going to see where he goes from there.
Elijah, quick question again. The only other international guy we've talked about going back to 2012 is Luis Robert. I'm curious, and so that doesn't really speak well at all for what the White Sox have done on the internationally. Can you think of some other notable draft picks? I mean, I know we've got a couple recently, Mongolan, but can you think of some guys that were notable at the time?
So he never cracked the top 10 or the top 5, at least, that I was going through, but Micker Adolfo is the first one that comes to mind. I know that was a big time signing, tons of upside, just never clicked, didn't work out for him. I think Luis Alexander Basabe was the third player in the Moncada and Kopech trade. Another guy who wasn't signed by the White Sox, but was a big time international guy. Didn't click for him either. I'm trying to think back at some of these other guys, but you're right. There has not been a lot of success aside from, I mean, Luis Robert was the big one. But in terms of players and signed by the White Sox that were international, there hasn't been a lot of success for a team that really values international signings and makes a lot of them. There hasn't been a ton that have gone well. I'm trying to think of any of the other big time ones. Yeah, but Adolfo is the first one that comes to mind. I'm going to look and see if I can find any others. But it is interesting. What's your take on that? Because the Sox generally, I mean, Jose Abreu, I guess that's one I should mention
Oh,
because I
right,
know
right,
he
right. Okay, that
technically wasn't a prospect. He wasn't a prospect because he immediately went to the majors, but that is I mean, obviously a home run hit on that one.
right.
What are your thoughts on, the fact that there hasn't been a lot of success in that department other than Robert?
Well, again, there are a couple different ways to build a roster. There's the draft, there's international signings, and trades are three of the ways. The draft, up until Colson Montgomery, hasn't really yielded very much, certainly compared to other teams. International signings, it doesn't sound like it's really yielded that much either. So I think, in a way,
Who am I kidding? Brian Ramos too. That's the one I definitely should have mentioned
oh,
also.
okay,
I know that's current, but Brian Ramos was an international signing, as was Lenyn Sosa as well. So I mean, those are not top five, right, in terms of those years, but more guys. But you're right. There hasn't been as much success there as you would like to see looking back.
what do you think relative to the draft? How would you describe the international signings?
I'd say kind of on par, to be honest. I mean,
Yeah,
the drafts, like we've talked about today, like the drafts haven't been great. I think the last few years have looked a lot better so far. But generally speaking, the last decade of drafts and international signings have not been great. I think Yolbert Sanchez is another one that I just saw when I was scrolling through stuff. There's been some guys, but in terms of guys that have really clicked, Robert's really the only one aside from Abreu, who was already a professional when he signed. And then, hopefully Brian Ramos, Jose Rodriguez, a lot of these other current guys are going to change that trend because there is some upside there for sure, but it hasn't been all that successful. Our last year, 2023, talk about let's hear the draft class. I know most people know this, and then we've talked a lot about the draft class, but tell us some of the
right.
first round picks or the
Yeah,
first picks, and then
Jacob Gonzalez, Grant Taylor, Seth Keener, and the other one of note, Calvin Harris.
yeah.
Yeah, and
George Walkow was a high drafted. Walkow was the seventh rounder, but signed to the second highest or third
right.
highest signing bonus of all the picks. So another guy worth note. And this is way too early to judge this class, but generally speaking, is an exciting class to follow for sure.
Yeah, and much like the 2022 class, a lot of depth in this class. And if you look at the 22 and the 23 draft classes, God, what does that make up? What, 2/3 of the top 30 list? Yeah,
Almost. Yeah, you're not
yeah,
wrong. And then 2023, the top prospect list, Colson Montgomery, first round pick, Noah Schultz, first round pick, Edgar Caro, trade, another guy that was made last year, the Giolito deal that, like we've said, we've acquired the talent acquisition via trade has been clear. It's just about the development from there and how that goes. Jacob Gonzalez, first round pick. Jake Eater was another trade acquisition. Nick Nastrini, another trade acquisition. And then Brian Ramos was, an international signing. So right now, looking at the system, a lot of players coming from a lot of places. And that's what's exciting about where we're at with this farm system. And that was really the culmination of this episode, in my opinion, Jeff, was that you can see right now the system is deeper and it's coming from all different places. There's players drafted that are moving up the ranks and impressing. There's acquisitions via trades that are going to be pieces for the future. There's international signings. Brian Ramos is the top one, Jose Rodriguez, who are legit pieces moving forward. There's a lot of players that have come from different places right now in the system, and that wasn't the case in a lot of these past years.
right. And if you're going to assign grades, I would say in terms of drafting the last 2 years, you have to give the White Sox an A. I mean, just because of the potential of these guys. International signings, maybe a B. They've done really well there. Trades, I would give them an A. So it's interesting. Going back to 2012, it's pretty mediocre for many years on all three fronts. But you're right. In the last 2 to 3 years, everything has changed and they look good. Their international signings, their drafting, and their trades.
I want to build off your grades. I would say for the last 2 years, I do like the draft. I wouldn't go A. I would go B, I think. Maybe B plus even. I think there's some good things. I didn't love a few of the draft picks. I think they could have gone a different direction with a few of the draft picks this past year. But I would give it like a B plus on drafting the past few years. I would say trades. is an A. I think that's a really good regard. International, beyond Ramos, I don't think there's anybody super of note. But then again, Mongolin and Ryan Burrows, who's another guy who are two recent guys that are both really exciting. So probably a B there too for me. What about we'll wrap on this. In the last decade, now that we did this whole episode, we broke down all the draft classes, all the lists over the last decade in total culmination. Where would you go grades wise in terms of draft picks, international signings, and trades?
All right. So that's actually pretty easy. If you're going to give them an A for if I'm going to give them an A for the last 2 years, I'm probably going to give them like a D- for the previous year. So it comes out to somewhere around a C plus B- for drafting. International, I would say the same thing. It's all C-, D+. Trades, I would actually give them a B+ on the trades. They've got a history of really strong trades.
Yeah, I'm similar to you. I think draft picks. Yes, I do like the last 2 years right now, and it's encouraging now, but you can't put that much stock into that yet because we haven't seen them reach the major leagues. So when all things considered, I'd go like C- for drafting probably. I think when we look at, I don't think I realized until today when we really did this and dove into it and talked about it, how poor some of those drafts have been. I mean, there's been draft classes that have truly amounted to nothing, unfortunately. International signings, I do give credit for both the Robert and I think Abreu is worth mentioning, even though he wasn't a prospect, just because international signings are such a gamble, and those are two, superstars. Abreu was an MVP with the White Sox. Robert is as talented as it gets. And then, so I think I'd go B- overall for international signings. And then in terms of trades, yeah, not all of them have worked, but a lot of them have been good trades. And in terms of value, they have done a good job getting value out of their players. So I think I'd go B+, and maybe even an A- for trades. I think the trade acquisitions have been good overall. So looking back at this, it's cool to see, and I hope everybody enjoyed listening to this because I enjoyed going through all this and just seeing where the organization's at. And I think both of us agree that right now the organization is in a better place in terms of talent acquisition and development than it has been for the last decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And one final note, we were looking at these other organizations. I think if you look at all those other organizations, they built their team. I mean, the Dodgers, for all the free agent signings, they've got a core of players that they drafted. The Braves have a core of players that they drafted, plus, Albies and Acuna, two phenomenal international guys. So you add those with like Austin Riley and Michael Harris. These other teams have done it. They've done it through the draft, through international signings, and through trades.
100%. It's important. You have to do it, and that's
it can be done.
The key to the next era of White Sox baseball is going to be how they develop this system, and we've talked about this time and time again. This year is a growth year, but the farm system and the signings and the trades are going to determine if this next era of White Sox baseball is a successful one. That's all we've got today. We talked a lot. This was a wonderful episode. Next week, again, tons of spring training content coming. Make sure to follow me at ElijahEV8, and you can follow Jeff at AAA Jeff on Twitter. We are very excited for everything we've got coming up. We're going to talk spring training next week. We're hoping to have a few guests on in March before the season kicks off. And that's all for the FutureSox Roundup. Thanks, Jeff.
That was a lot of fun today, Elijah. Have a great trip to Arizona. Can't wait to start seeing some of your tweets and then talk to you next week.
Very excited too. Thanks, Jeff.
Yep.